Welcome back to episode 6, everyone, and we're moving into part 3, which is all about stored procedures. So let's head on in to SQL Server Management Studio. Here we go. Let's change that database once again, and we're ready to begin on the Wide World Importers database. Okay then, simple stored procedure. You can see from the code it pretty much looks very similar to your function, especially the table valued function. Now that's where stored procedures are really good at, is returning a table of data in the results and can be used in by a variety of different products like reporting, etc., to bring back data itself. Obviously we can pass in parameters, which is really great with the procedure. However, somewhat different to the function, we can actually leave out those parameters, so we can have a parameterless stored procedure in a way. And then we can still create the procedure without any parameters. Another reason why stored procedures are good is that SQL Server often memorizes the execution query plan. So instead of having to think every time how it's going to execute that stored procedure, it's got the methodology saved in the database, so whenever you run it the next time, it remembers how it should actually run that stored procedure, and it's very quick then in producing the results, which is great. You can of course embed functions within your stored procedure, and you can also embed other stored procedures within your stored procedure itself. However, you can only do this down to one level. So if you have one stored procedure which calls another stored procedure, and that second stored procedure calls another one, your query will fail. Well, when you try to create that stored procedure, you might be able to create it, but when you execute it, it says it doesn't like it. So you can't daisy chain stored procedures more than twice. So that's where you then have to have the table valued function if you're going to be calling one function after the next, and then lastly into a stored procedure. To create the procedure, pretty standard, similar to every other object. We simply put create procedure, then of course we give it the schema dot, and then we name it. In this case I've put in USP, and once again your company that you start working for may have coding standards and may decide to put this first few letters to show it's a stored procedure in a different manner. This one I'm going to call yearly invoicing, and all we're going to do, pass in the year and our tax percentage to get our yearly invoicing. Now you can see here I've already assigned values to these parameters that we're chucking in. So even if you ran off the stored procedure to get some results and you left the parameters blank, it will still bring you back some values based on these two parameters here. Now you don't need to put those in. As you can see, it works fine there. Comment that out. But sometimes it's nice to put defaults in if that makes it easier to get going on the procedure itself. So what we're going to do is we're going to pass in the year as an integer. We're going to pass in the tax percentage as a decimal. In previous examples we've used a float as well, but this one we're just going to do a decimal up to 2 decimal places, and it's going to be 20% as a default. Now obviously when you pass parameters in, different parameters to these, it will apply those different parameters. These are only like defaults if it doesn't receive any parameters being passed into it. We do the open and close brackets just like with a function, and we separate different parameters with a comma. And then we begin with the as command there. Now, different to the function, there's no return this or returns that and the other or returns table. We simply then crack on with the code itself, bringing in the parameter that we want to do in any of our filtering. Here you got the tax percentage. Pretty straightforward. Into that function, and we should get our results just like the previous functions and views, etc. that we've been working on. You can also make it slightly transactional, have a beginning and an end if you want to. However, you don't necessarily need to put those in there. In with the go, and let's give it a try. Command's executed, fine. So what do? What we need to do then, to get results, is we execute the store procedure. Whereas with the function and the view, you select from them. Here, we actually have to execute the store procedure itself, because it is a procedure, a specific process. And somewhat different to the function, parameters we pass in, we don't need to put them in brackets. As you can see here, it gives a little bit of an error. So we just leave the brackets out. Obviously the year putting in is 2015, and we're looking at a tax rate of 10%. So let's give that a go. Let's execute that. And it passes those parameters in to our store procedure, and it churns out the results. There's your 10% of the invoice amount, and you can see that the data looks very much similar to what we had going on in the table valued function in the previous video. So pretty simple to write, pretty simple to create. All the complexity really is in your select statement here, and you just pass in the parameters you want to use if you want to use parameters. So remember, the main reason to use procedures is that they can be very efficient once they've been run once, and the query plan is stored within SQL Server, and then it can just easily churn out the data you want. However, the limitation is, of course, when you start embedding stored procedures within other stored procedures, there is a limitation on that, as opposed to the function, which you can keep calling functions within functions, etc. So, pretty straightforward. Let's look at another scenario and build up another stored procedure. So, you've been asked to create a stored procedure that outputs salesperson name and their order IDs, invoice IDs, and invoice line IDs linked to them per year. So you need to be able to pass the salesperson's ID and the invoice year into your stored procedure when you create this. Fancy giving that a try? If so, pause the video, give it a go, and when you come back, when you're ready, we'll crack on with my solution. Okay then, first step, as always, is to build up our stored procedure. So what are we after? Salesperson's name. That's the first one we'll start working on. And we know that our salesperson's name is stored in the people application. People, here we go. SP. So we're after the person's name. Full name, let's go for that. Person's ID, and we've got the salesperson ID within our order ID, our invoicing table, etc., etc. So let's bring that in. Here we've got our orders, invoices, etc. So let's just grab this code, make it simple for ourselves. Paste that in there as O. In fact, do we have salesperson ID, in all invoices? Probably not. Alrighty, we just have the customer. Here we go, salesperson's ID. So we don't even need the orders table. If you have brought in the orders table and you've linked it to people, then no problem at all. Order ID, we do have the order ID in invoices. Here's the order ID. So we've got it covered with just these three tables. Once again, if you've brought in the orders table, that's absolutely fine. I'm sure we'll get the same values at the end. Person ID equals person ID. So there we've got, they're all linked up. Now we can pull the order ID from the invoicing table. And then the invoice ID as well from the same table. And lastly, we've got the line item IDs, invoice line IDs. So there we have it per year. So there's some filtering going on. Let's check our query, run that off, and there we go. Pretty easy. Pretty straightforward stuff there. So we need to now create our stored procedure. And we're going to call it, again, we're going to use a sales schema for this, USP invoices per year, for want of a better name. Here we go, and we pass in the salesperson ID and the invoice ID. And that's an integer, and then the year. Go. Also an integer, pretty straightforward stuff. Not forgetting the as. We can do a begin if we want to. And of course we have to end that too. If you start with a begin, you have to have an end. So we've got our two parameters. Invoice year, we can put a filter on this one here for the invoice year, and we're going to be bringing this one in here, not forgetting our system function year, and we've brought in our year to filter on. Person ID is next. Let's copy that, we'll bang it in our where clause. After salesperson ID, person ID, there we go, equals person ID. Fantastic. Looks pretty straightforward. Let's create the procedure. And of course, like with every other object, if you needed to alter that for whatever reason, you need to change it, simply do an alter there. Fantastic. So we've now got our stored procedure, and where exactly are those held? Well, let's have a look at our database, minimize tables, and go to programmability. In there, you've got your stored procedures themselves. As you can see, there's tons of system stored procedures. Normally those have got to do with database administrational purposes, but if we minimize system stored procedures, that's already minimized. Let's have a look for ours, sales, USP, invoices per year. So that's where it's stored, away from the system stored procedures. As you can see, there's tons of them there, and within the normal list here. Quite a few being brought in when we restored the database itself. These are all the user defined ones that have been added to the database, and they're all in programmability there. So now let's see if our store procedure works. To do that, we execute store procedures. Now, as you can see there, if we hover over it, expects a parameter which is not supplied because we didn't put any defaults in there. If we did, for example, as you can see, it goes away. But we didn't to begin with, so let's put those in and see if we get any results. Nothing for salesperson ID 1. Let's try 2. And we start getting some results there. So there's the full name coming in, Kayla Woodcock. There's the order ID, there's the invoice ID, and there's the invoice line ID for all 6,322 orders going on there. So that's what I've got for that little scenario there. Hopefully you got the same thing, but as you can see, it's really simple to just create your select statement, then bring in your create procedure bit of code, any parameters you want, create them within the brackets, separate multiple with a comma, and then simply just add them into your code like that. Lastly, check your code by passing in different parameters. Let's go for 3, see if we get a different result. There you go, Hudson Onslow, and he has as well over 6,000 different order lines there. Brilliant stuff, very straightforward. Again, all the complexity really is in the select statement itself, but once you've done that, then you can wrap your procedure code around that. Alrighty then, that's pretty much it for store procedures. So, just to wrap up what we've covered in these first 3 parts, looking at the views, the functions and the store procedures, when you're likely to use which. Well, the view is simply a set of code that is going to be used quite often. You can create that and you can store it in the database itself. It's pretty simple in so much that you can't pass parameters into it, and you can only have one select statement within that view itself. However, you can have CTEs, inline functions, etc., etc. The functions, on the other hand, the 2 types, you got the tabular, which is the main one used, and the scalar, which is also regularly used, and of course you've got your system functions, which we've seen here. So here is a built-in function that gets installed into SQL Server when you install it onto your computer. But of course we can create our own functions, and the scalar functions, you're returning one single value, normally a little bit of computational code to get that, and then the tabular one, you're returning an entire table of columns and rows of data. Now obviously with the functions you can pass in parameters, so that's really useful, but remember that with functions quite often you will be using them as one of the columns here within your select statement, so the query will need to run it for each line within that select statement, so there can be a little bit of a hit to performance on that, but again very useful. So scalar, when you just want to calculate one single value, pass that in using a parameters to pass into the function, and the tabular when you are using quite a lot of tables within procedures and other functions to call other tables, etc., etc. And finally, the stored procedure itself, it can be quite a complex bit of code. Here we've just got the one select statement, but of course, once again, like the functions, you can pretty much pass in parameters to basically filter your results there on that. And the great thing about the store procedure is that it's very efficient to run, because once you've run it off once, SQL Server stores the query plan so it knows exactly how it's going to run off your set of code the next time you run it. And of course, as opposed to functions and views, we execute the store procedure as opposed to selecting from it. So that's it from me. Please join me in part 4 where we continue the lessons. Until then, everyone, I hope you all have a fantastic day.